Hello friends, this is Jay Hendricks with Powerful Thought Daily. Today I wanted to talk with you more about Carl Jung, and I'm going to have a playlist of Carl Jung, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to delve into his book, AION. So if you want to pick that book up and start reading it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read each chapter and make notes, and then I'll just read my notes to you. So it's kind of like a Cliff Notes version. And if you want to talk about it, if you want to discuss it, please share your thoughts on any of these topics. So here we go. The first chapter is the ego. Ego is related to all conscious contents and forms the center for the field of consciousness. That's the ego. It could also be called the personality and all personal acts of consciousness. All conscious contents are a relationship between the ego and the psychic contents. The limits of the ego are what is unknown or what it is unconscious of. There are external unknowns and internal unknowns, and the internal unknowns are considered the unconscious. The ego is conscious of external things through the body senses and the production of psychic images from those sensations. This process mostly happens unconsciously. Who knows if all of these sense instruments have psychic content in them, but Jung labels his use of the word psychic to point where there is evidence of a will that can modify reflexes or instinctual processes. Concepts must be narrow enough to be suitable instruments of specification. So we must use concepts as instruments. And if they get too vague, then they're not useful and not suitable. All right, Jung identifies three groups of contents. Memory, which is content that can be reproduced voluntarily. The second one is unconscious contents that cannot be reproduced voluntarily, and which arise from spontaneous eruption. And third, contents that cannot be made conscious or never will be. So he just infers all of these things. Okay, the ego is distinguishable from the whole field of consciousness and is a point of reference that is limited by the body and senses. This point of reference, the ego, seems to arise from the collision between the body and the environment, generally speaking. It continues its development as the body and environment collide throughout a lifetime. So it's an interplay. Since the ego has the capacity to extend its limits infinitely, it cannot be considered more or less than consciousness as a whole. The picture of a conscious personality only includes that which is conscious, and the personality as a totality must include the unconscious parts as well. So the personality cannot be fully described or conceptualized. The unconscious parts are the most decisive and can only be observed by others or discovered with outside help. This is partly why I do these videos and why it's so important to talk about our conceptions with others. We must help each other become more conscious because we don't know what we're unconscious of. That's why we need others. So the total personality that includes the conscious and unconscious cannot be equated to the ego or the conscious personality. The ego is part of the self, and free will and free choice exist inside the field of consciousness of the ego. The free will constantly clashes with things outside our field of consciousness when it contacts facts of the self, just as it does our free will clashes with the environment all the time. Things don't always go our way or go against our will. Just as our free will is limited by outside happenings, The same is when we contact the self and see it as an objective happening. The ego can do nothing to the self. So yeah, I'll say that again. The ego can do nothing to the self, but the self develops the ego by immersing it in unconscious contents. That's what life is. It's a series of ethical decisions, basically. That's developing our ego. One of the main characteristics of the ego is individuality, of which the identity changes through life experience. This is done by the will as it adapts the ego. While the ego is the center of the field of consciousness, it is likely not the center of the total personality. We cannot say how free or dependent the ego is of the self, but there is determinism as well as free will. If we estimate this wrongly, there are consequences that he goes into later in the book. So there is determinism and free will. And we don't know what the ratio of that is. Maybe it's growing the will larger and larger and larger and aligning it to what is determined, perhaps. Okay, we cannot... let's see. The last thing, Jung's hypothesis is, from the view of the personality, there is an extra-conscious psyche with personal contents and an extra-conscious psyche with impersonal and collective contents. This takes into account our individuality as well as the commonalities and psychic structures between all human beings. So, it's quite a heavy book. Hopefully some of that made sense. So I'm going to be doing this with all the chapters, and feel free to comment, discuss these things with me, tell me what you think about these ideas. Jung was a very smart guy, and I tend to agree with everything he says, pretty much. So, he's one of the main guys I study, so I guess that's why I agree with him. But I try to retain my own views and see what he's saying. So anyway, like, subscribe. I'm Jay Hendricks. This is Powerful Thought Daily. Have a good day. Bye.